Today is the 5th of October. It's 1600 hours. I want to discuss the whole Russia-Ukraine thing in layman's terms for many of you who probably don't understand what's going on. I like to think that I know a little bit about a lot of places around the world. By any means, I'm not an expert, but the Russian-Ukraine thing is kind of interesting to me because I'll give you a little bit of a background. I had my own business for 10 years, and I was in the same business for about 30 years. And a lot of those people in this particular industry were Eastern Europeans. And most of them, it would be like Serbia, Croatia. Now, where it was when the Soviet Union eventually split up, and all the Eastern Bloc nations split up. So now they got these little countries, Albania, but at one time there was a country called Yugoslavia, and it's been divided into a couple smaller countries at this point. And I became friends with some of these business owners and stuff that are from that part of the world. So just to kind of give you a real layman's terms, a layman's feel about this stuff. The Russian people as a whole have been Russians, Eastern Europeans have been lumped into something called Slavs. Slovakians, it was all, they were always called Slavs. And Hitler, when he was invading Russia, it was his goal to turn that whole place into slaves. It's what he called, we're going to make the Slavs our slaves. But they're all essentially from the same stock, Slavs. So if you're going to mention Slavs, you're talking about all Eastern Europe. Particularly down towards the Balkans. And so you have, and you have all these, ancient Europe goes back for so long, with such a long recorded history going back since the Roman Empire. Before that, actually, but so we're going to get back to Russia. Russia at one time encompassed a great part of that area. Okay, so the Eastern Europeans and Russia are closely connected, even like Poland. It's part of it. It's on the border with Russia. So you have a very similar culture amongst all of them. So, but just to make this real simple, the Russian people were never a free people, ever. They never had a form of democracy. Where they're at now under Putin is the closest thing they've ever had to democracy since the fall of the Soviet Union in the early 90s, mid-90s. And they enjoy an amount of freedom there that they never had before. Now, you may not realize that or not, but they went from serfs. At the time of our country was formed, these people were under a serfdom, a medieval system of government where you're just a little bit higher than a slave. See, you couldn't sell the people, but you could sell the land and the people came with it as part of the deal. So they had a serfdom, a medieval form of government, and they were the only ones left with that by the time the 1900s came around. So they had the Tsar, and that's where the term Tsar came from. That was their version of a king, okay? And you had a royal family that went back freaking forever. And regardless of the people being under the thumb of that, they took a lot of pride in having a Tsar. Well, when the Bolsheviks took over with their communist revolution in 1917, it totally ruined. They destroyed the Russian monarchy, and they totally disassembled their culture and rebuilt it. That's what communists do. But it kind of went underground. The Russians have always been a really, really proud people, but they've never lived under a democracy. And see, what you need to understand, some parts of the world, you can't have a democracy. Because the only thing that certain people groups around the world understand is having a strong man. They need a strong man. Like Iraq is a good example of that. They need that. They cannot have a democracy. Because if democracies evolve slowly out of a monarchy, and you end up with a constitutional monarchy, with a representative monarchy, with a parliamentary system, democracy evolved out of that. Our republic, I should say, a constitutional representative republic evolved out of that. So to expect the Russians to behave like the rest of the world, don't expect that. So to get on this thing with Ukraine and my experience with people who come from that part of the world, they tend to have allegiances, okay, depending on how much influence the Russians had over them. And some people were, some of these people are very pro-Russian, and some of them are anti-Russian, based on where you're at. Well, that's what is going on in Ukraine, and it's been going on since the Soviet Union broke up. You have parts of the Soviet Union, parts of Ukraine that are pro-Russian, and Russian people have settled there. In case you didn't know, Ukrainian people, there's several different Slavic languages there, but they all speak Russian because it was under Soviet control for so long. But they do have native languages. So you have different parts of Ukraine that are pro-Russian, and they want to be part of the Russian Federation, and some don't. So it's kind of like a civil war. And there was a lot of funny business that went on under the Clinton administration, with us installing pro-American leadership there and overthrowing pro-Russian leadership. We were playing that regime change nonsense there, and that didn't help things. So here's the other thing that they aren't telling you about. During World War II, when the Nazis were at the height of their power, there was a faction in Ukraine, in that area, that embraced the Nazi ideology, and that is still that was never destroyed. There, it was never destroyed, and they have been, and since Ukraine became an independent nation, they want to do ethnic cleansing of pro-Russian people, and that's been going on there. And there are parts of Ukraine that have been trying, the people that are pro-Russian, that consider themselves Russians, have been appealing to Putin for 10 years or so. Hey, we need help. The Ukrainian government ignores what these Nazis are doing, and they attack us, and we need help. So Putin decided that this is going to be part of it. The other thing is, when the Soviet Union fell, there was an agreement that because Ukraine is on the border, that they would be a neutral country, that there would not be any imprint of NATO on Russia's doorstep, which is reasonable. You cannot blame Russian leadership for not wanting want American military on their borders. It would be the same if the best way to describe it, we weren't happy when the Soviet Union decided to cozy up with Cuba and have missiles pointed at us. It's the same thing. If you look at a map, see how close Cuba is to Florida? We almost had a world war over that. Well, this is very similar, except for it's reversed. We're over there playing games. Well, they've been playing games over there for a long time, and Ukraine is a very poor nation, and the European Union has never really, that was part of the deal too, that they wouldn't become part of the European Union, and they wouldn't become part of the NATO. They wanted like a neutral country. Well, our politicians have been playing around in there. Hunter Biden, Nancy Pelosi, John Kerry, Mitt Romney, and I'm sure there's several others that have been playing around. And what it comes down to is a giant money laundering scheme going on in there. And everybody knows it. They all know it. Don't you find it interesting that once Biden becomes president, there's something in Putin who says, I'm going in, something's going to happen in Ukraine? Don't you find that interesting? If you think that's just a coincidence, you ain't paying attention. So the media keeps saying, oh, the Russians, this was unprovoked. That's a complete lie. Of course it was provoked. Because Putin for the past 30 years has been warning, don't do this, don't do this, don't do this. We don't want missiles pointing at us. We don't want this. No NATO expansion, no European Union. We don't want it, we don't want it, we don't want it. All of a sudden. So he was provoked, and he felt that he had to act. And there's probably some other nuances to this. Like I said, I'm not a geopoliticist. I'm not. But I'm not stupid. But see, a lot of people don't understand the historical context that this is wrapped in. It's in some ways it's kind of Civil War-ish, if I can use that term. But that's really what it is, and it should be a relatively easy thing to solve peacefully, because Putin isn't asking for much. But there's shady business going on. And is it a shock? Now, and it's funny how so many Americans, oh, you're pushing Russian propaganda. You don't need it. All you have to do is look in a little bit of a history book, and you can pretty much formulate things. And like I said, a lot of these countries, you're never going to have a real democracy because they need a strong man. That's the only way they understand. It's like expecting the Middle East to be a real democracy. It's not. You took those people in the Middle East were Bedouin sheep herders until after World War II, which wasn't long ago. And when the use of petroleum really became like gold, and it made them rich overnight. You turn. It's like giving cavemen nukes, right? It's like giving a caveman an AK. They have no self-control and discipline. Now, does this sound terrible? Some people it probably does, but this is a human thing, folks. It's a human thing. This is how people are. The great thing about development and history and understanding is generally we learn better when we go slowly, and we learn along the way, and things evolve. You need time to do this, and Western civilization is a perfect example of it. Are we kind of in a post-Western civilization type thing with the nonsense I see politically in this nation? Oh, absolutely. And that's another thing you need to understand. The Eastern countries are extremely conservative countries. They're very pro-family. None of this woke nonsense. None of this liberal nonsense. They don't put up with any of that. And we're in there trying to push this stuff. Let me tell you something. The homosexual stuff is not going to fly. Doesn't fly in Russia. Doesn't fly in Eastern Europe. You think that transgender stuff flies over there? It doesn't. But boy, oh boy, do we embrace it here. Here's another thing you need to think of. You don't think it flies over in the Middle East either, do you? And that affects how they see us. And that affects how they see us, and we're trying to push our agenda onto them. And this is, and you know what? Donald Trump had a really good example of what good foreign policy is. Let's just get along with everybody. Let's reach out, try to meet them where they're at, and just get along with everybody. Try to have an understanding and not push our bullshit on other people. But you don't get that from our media now, do we? So now we got a lot of saber rattling going on. Putin threatening the nukes and this, that, and the other thing. I got a real easy thing in regards to this. We've had 2 world wars start in that part of the world. 2. It ain't a big shock that you see this stuff going on. And you have nefarious characters behind the scenes that are pushing this kind of nonsense. You know, all you have to do is just Google George Soros and what what countries want to arrest him. Take a look at that. There's a reason for that. In case you didn't know, that guy, George Soros, is living in this country. Now, I'm making this just as easy for anybody to understand, man. I mean, a 10-year-old can understand what I'm talking about here. So, what are they doing? Yeah, I mean, the Russians' pipeline just kind of magically popped some holes in it, and the Russians sabotaged it. It's out of the Russian playbook. And you know what? Just leave these people alone. Let them figure out their own problems. I'm sorry. Let Ukraine figure out their own problems. Let Russia figure out their own problems. Let them figure this stuff out. Let all these Europeans figure this stuff out. You know, it was I think it was George Washington said, "Stay out of the affairs of Europe." And that was a doctrine that we have for a long time. And then we had something called the Monroe Doctrine, which was, we're going to stay on our side of the hemisphere, you stay on your side of the hemisphere and worry about your stuff here, and we're going to worry about our stuff here. And now that is called, that's isolationist. That's isolationist. You know what? There is nothing wrong with this stuff. You get embroiled in this world affair nonsense, and this is the kind of shit you get dragged into. And look, make no doubt about it. If this stuff escalates, the amount of life loss will be beyond catastrophic. And in the modern day and age, I don't know if we could ever recover. It would be worse than anything. It'd be worse than both world wars and everything, because you'd have a lot of starvation, people freezing to death, and and here's something else you all have to realize. When you start playing games with energy, the very first things that are going to suffer are going to be the animals. You need to understand this. When you start playing games with energy, and you start playing with this Green New Deal shit, the first thing that's going to suffer are wild animals. Because when you start messing around with our agriculture, and you start messing around with the way people heat their homes, first thing that's going to pay a price are going to be trees. The second thing that's going to be price are the animals that live within all those trees in those areas. No one ever talks about that stuff. But that happens when you start playing around with how we produce food and fertilizer and so on in agriculture. And all of this stuff is tied in because the Russians are huge exporters of fossil fuel products. And I'm going to leave you with something that nobody ever says, nobody ever talks about, and I've never heard anybody say but myself. The only reason that there are whales swimming in our ocean today, at this day and time, the only reason there are whales is because of petroleum products. And if you don't know why, I am not about to give you a history lesson on whaling. Well, I hope you got something out of this. Till next time.